Hi everyone, and welcome to the Using Data to Build Community session at the Smart Cities Council conference. We're really excited to be coming you together from a combined effort in the east coast of the US and in the east coast of Australia to talk about innovative ways of using data to build community. But I think if you'd had this topic 12 months ago, the conversation that we would be having would be so different from the one that we're going to have today. In the last 12 months, the world has been turned upside down, or perhaps right side up, depending which way you look at it, across the impacts of COVID worldwide, racial uprising, the rise of Black Lives Matter, and a whole range of other social and economic issues that are associated with those changes that mean that we're in a fundamentally different and changing and unpredictable world than we were previously. Even if you look at the fact that every 25 seconds someone dies in a traffic collision, the impacts of our public realm and are having such a large impact on our health and well-being. And that question is more important than ever. So we're really excited to have a conversation about these topics today. My name's Lucinda. I'm a co-founder of Neighbourlytics. I'm here today with Mariela, Alfonzo, founder and CEO of State of Place, Emily Yates, Smart Cities Director at the City of Philadelphia, Andrea DiGiovanni, Strategic Projects Lead at Neighbourlytics, and Michael Northey, the Project Officer of Place Services in the Property of Place team at the City of Parramatta. If you don't know Parramatta, that's in the sort of inner west of Sydney, Australia. By way of introduction, I also want to acknowledge the traditional land which we're coming to you from today. We have a practice in Australia of land acknowledgements. I'm in the north of Melbourne, so I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country, part of the Kulin Nation. I expect that Michael is in Eora country, but I might need you to confirm that. Yeah, Eora country. And of all of the lands that we come to today, we just want to acknowledge that, particularly in the context of place. It's a really important past, present and future to be a part of. So just to kick us off today, I really want to think about the role of data in 2020 and COVID. And I want to start with Mariela. And I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about State of Place, but particularly how you use data to understand places and what's that meant this year in terms of COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Lucinda, for moderating this great panel discussion. So State of Place is an urban design data and predictive analytics software. We help city makers crunch data around microscale urban design features into an understandable score of what's working and what's not from an urban design and built environment perspective. And we have a variety of forecasting tools that help our users kind of envision new potential for places and actually quantify those impacts in real time. Really creating an environment in which you can test cases without actually building things, and with that also engage the community in co-creation of those places via a more democratized way of using data. So our goal, of course, is to use this data to create more livable, equitable, and sustainable places, that all people can access and love and enjoy, and reap all of the exponential benefits that come with good urban design. So that's what State of Place is in a nutshell, and I'm happy to answer further questions as we go into the discussion. But to answer your question around COVID, well, I mean, that's basically what brought Emily and I together earlier this year, looking at the city of Philadelphia. We both were painfully aware of the health disparities, the disparities around COVID rates. And we both inherently understood that many of those comorbidities that were exacerbating COVID in vulnerable communities were tied to disparities from the built environment to begin with. So they were, these places are not facilitating healthier behaviors. It makes it harder even to socially distance during COVID. So how could we use data to tackle this new problem, this new and yet existing problem, right? So we, we're basically creating whole new forecasting models. Most of our forecasting models before were focused on how does urban design influence economic development, or environmental mitigation, or kind of just more general health outcomes and safety, but not COVID, right? This is a new thing that's changed, not just the world, but State of Place's trajectory. And what I like about, I wouldn't say like about the pandemic, there's nothing to like about the pandemic, but what this has brought to bear that I think had been a long time coming is the fact that equity now is right and center. And it's a lot harder to look the other way or to just put an equity lens on something. And so that's what we're trying to help our city makers capitalize upon via data and evidence.
Wow, thanks. And I think you raised such an interesting point around, it's not that these health inequities or inequalities were not there previously, but COVID has kind of put cities through the stress test and brought those to the forefront of the conversation. I want to throw to you, Emily, just to give us a little bit of context about Philadelphia, I guess, particularly in light of what's happened in 2020, and what was your initial interest in working with State of Place and using data differently in that context of trying to get some metrics and understanding what's going on?
The big fail of Zoom, the mute.
Someone has to do it, so
I know. I'm happy to burst that bubble. I'm really excited to be here. This is such a great topic to be talking about in the smart city space. I think it needs to be talked about more, so I'm really thrilled that I'm able to be here with you guys. In Philadelphia, we define a smart city really as a city that uses integrated information and communication technology to support the economic, social, and environmental goals of its communities. And in that definition, which is a very generic, in my opinion, definition of smart cities, it's clearly putting like the technology and data front and center. And since I started this role about a year ago, I've been working really hard to bring the community much more forward and use them to help define what our problems are, and really ensuring that we're kind of following our framework, which is that we're locally inspired. There's a lot of pride here in Philadelphia. We are not Silicon Valley, so it's very important that it's locally inspired, that we're innovative, equitable, and collaborative. And I think I've taken those four kind of phrases to heart, especially in light of COVID. So Philadelphia, for people listening that aren't familiar, we're the 6th largest city in the United States, but we are also the largest poorest city in the United States. So we have approximately 25% of our population living at or below federal poverty level, which equates to about 400,000 households, which is a pretty staggering statistic. We are a majority city as well. And what we experienced with COVID was severe budget cuts. So we lost over $750 million in our latest budget round. And it amplified, to Mariela's point, things that are already been existing, but really brought them front and center. We have a massive digital divide. Approximately, 25% of our population also doesn't have access to internet or technology. And that's huge, especially as we're moving to things like digital learning, and that can really create a bigger divide between those students and their learning. So we also have, as most cities in the US at least have experienced, that our communities of color were harder hit by COVID. And then they're also being harder hit by environmental events that we have here. So not only are they having to deal with COVID, but they're having to deal with heat island impact or urban flooding, which we've had quite a lot of rain this summer and experienced that. Being in these situations and saying, how can we utilize tech and data, not in the quintessential way that tech and data in smart cities is often looked at. It was really nice to talk to Mariela and understand that this tech tool was out there that could really help the city take data in a new way and use it to inform how we are moving forward and practicing what we preach, which is we want to be more racially equitable in the way that we spend money. And so this data is going to be helping us. And we've discovered that more and more as we peel back the layers of those onions here in the city of all the opportunities that we have to use this tool to help us.
Thank you so much. And thanks also for the context there. I think for the global audience that's listening, we probably could put Philadelphia on a map, but certainly I wasn't aware of some of the, I guess, challenges and opportunities of the city. I want to throw to Andrea now to talk a little bit about Neighbourlytics, but also specifically the Launch Cities program, which is built on the Neighbourlytics database, which is something that you've really been leading around, looking particularly at measuring place-based wellbeing differently. Do you want to give us a little bit of an outline about what that program is, and I guess why it's important to think about different ways of measuring place?
So at Neighbourlytics, we use social data to really understand place and place performance. We're looking at place performance and using this social data in a behavioral context to really understand how a place is really providing or not providing the best opportunities for good well-being, for especially around place-based social determinants of health, and what levers are available to local government to really have a positive impact on those place-based social determinants of health, and to be able to measure impact over time of interventions and programs that they're community. And we really saw this as an area where data and particularly quantitative measurement of these place-based social determinants of health and of the behavioral indicators that are really showing us how well the place is or isn't supporting those was kind of a gap area. Typically, these are things that are measured only qualitatively, and it's really difficult to use that type of data, to obtain that type of data at a population scale persistently over time, and then to be able to use that data that's in such a disparate form in concert with other quantitative data, like the type of data that State of Place uses, to be able to quantify these things that typically are only measured in a qualitative way. So we're really focused on how can we quantify the social life of places and understand what that social life of places is really telling us about the well-being of the people who live there and how well the place is supporting the well-being of the people who live there. And our Launch Cities program is a program to really enable and to support local governments who are doing this for the first time, doing this type of quantitative measurement around place-based indicators of well-being is new for a lot of councils, a lot of local governments. It's typically something that they're measuring with surveys or focus groups or community engagement. And the program is really geared towards giving them all of the support and tools, and also bringing them together in a community of practice so they can really learn from each other and share best practices and insights and experiences to enable them to be successful with this new part of their data journey.
Thanks, Andrea. And on that note, I want to throw to Michael. City of Parramatta is one of the launch cities, and you've been working with Andrea over the past sort of 6 months. But I guess in the context of that, I'm wondering if you can first tell us a little bit about City of Parramatta, which I guess for our global audience may or may not be able to put Parramatta on the map. Perhaps you know where Sydney is, but Parramatta is a particularly unique place for Sydney, but also for Australia. And I'm interested to hear a little bit more about what it's been like for you during COVID in Parramatta, and perhaps some of the city context.
Of course, thank you, Lucinda. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land before I begin. I'm coming from the eastern coast of Sydney in the Sutherland Shire, so I'm on the land of the Darrawal people. And in Parramatta, the traditional owners are the Darug people. COVID's been particularly an interesting time for the city of Parramatta, and to provide a bit of context around our city, it's the central river city for within our three cities metropolis here in New South Wales. And I think everyone really knows the Sydney CBD, the Eastern Harbour City, and increasingly we are experiencing a lot of public and private investment. We've got a 5-year development pipeline of over $20 billion in public and private investment that is being funneled into really delivering enhancing the existing city that we have. We're a rapidly growing city. As of the last census, I think we're around about 226,000 residents, and we're tipped to kind of go over about 400,000 residents by 2036. So we're experiencing quite a lot of anticipated growth. And in the 5 years up to our last census, we were growing around a little bit over 3% per annum. So it's a city that is constantly evolving, and one that I think has rapidly changed, and there's a new image around what the city is and what it's offering. And we've got Australia's largest urban gentrification or renewal project at Parramatta Square, and there is so much investment happening in terms of connecting people into the city, but also connecting people and creating jobs so that people can actually travel locally within these kind of ideas of our 30-minute cities, so that people can really work, live, and enjoy all that City of Parramatta has to offer. COVID, of course, has been particularly a tough period and a challenging period for most cities, but one that I think the City of Parramatta has embraced. We've been supported despite having some concerns around what we'd be able to do with our budget cuts and not necessarily receiving the rates and where we're going to be spending the money. Some of the responses that we've had for COVID are things, like small business grants, and also being able to start to change things around our parking restrictions to help kind of facilitate that kind of click and collect model of goods that are being purchased, and also to help people to kind of travel more locally to get the supplies that they need, and also allow people to become more aware of what services are operating within COVID and what businesses still had their doors open and were able to provide those kind of essential services to our community members. It's been a really interesting time, and Council has fully endorsed the support of the work that my team does in place services, which is to continue this kind of capital works program and pipeline that we work on to deliver these really interesting and meaningful places, assets, and opportunities for our community to come together to congregate and use the physical and natural environment. We were really interested in working with Andrea and Lucinda from Neighbourlytics because of the data that we didn't previously have access to. As Andrea mentioned, it's about being able to leverage these kind of qualitative insights that we don't necessarily get across that kind of population spread. And as our people are changing, as our communities are changing, it's really important to start to understand the behaviours and how people are using the spaces that we currently have, but how we can start to make more informed decisions moving forward to help create spaces that people really love, spaces that are really livable, and spaces that help attract visitors into the city of Parramatta as we move forward.
Thanks very much, Michael. I want to kind of open up a little bit of a discussion now around, particularly around data innovation. I guess both State of Place in very synergetic ways are looking at perhaps innovative ways of shedding a light on place in a way that we haven't understood it before, or have only understood it qualitatively, not quantitatively. And I want to, I guess, throw to you, Michael, and then Emily, particularly about looking at the role of data within city governments. And I know that city governments have huge amounts of data, but sometimes it can be challenging to apply. And I want to, I guess, ask you about what it's been like to work with new data sets, because perhaps even working with existing data set can sometimes be a challenge, but then working with a more innovative or newer source of data also has its challenges. So I'd be interested to know, like, what was interesting for you in the first instance about looking at that source of data and what that's been like, and perhaps just stick with you for a moment, Michael, and then I'll throw back to Emily.
Great, thanks, Lucinda. I think that there's some inherent challenges that emerge with government bodies as we are early adopters of new and emerging data and innovations. And I think at City of Parramatta, something that we found most interesting about working with Neighbourlytics is this kind of alternative data that can be provided. For us, data plays such a big role in creating people-centric environments, and it's really hard to create places that are focused for people without actually consulting or engaging, or having data that speaks to what people are doing or using our spaces for. And for us, it's I think when we first engaged some of the other cities as part of our Launch Cities program, it's this idea that, maybe this data is going to be, answer all of our questions. But I think one of the great things about having this additional data set is that really it starts to shape and offer new perspectives to existing problems and challenges that we're receiving, but also helps build, this more rich picture of what our environment is, both our physical and natural attributes that make up the local and neighbourhood centres that our people constantly frequent, and also the associated amenities within those areas. And working with Neighbourlytics, the data that's being provided has been particularly interesting for us as we start to embed new ways of looking and new ways of seeing and interpreting places that typically we would have to rely on different data sets or more kind of laborious, longer drawn out processes to kind of get some of those rich insights.
Thank you. And Emily, working in smart cities, I'm sure you're working with a lot of different types of data at Philadelphia. But I'm interested to know, what was interesting for you about sort of seeking out new data sources to complement what you already understand?
That's a really good question. We do, one of the things that we pride ourselves in Philadelphia is the amount of data that we collect and how we store it and make it accessible. We have our Open Data Philly website. So data is inherent and critical to smart cities. I think similar to what Michael mentioned, some of the challenges we run around getting new data sets is, the tension, risk, do we want to collect data that might not paint us in the best light as a city, right? That's always a little bit, we don't want to give more ammunition to the community to come at us, but at the same time, I think it's important that we acknowledge where we're not doing well and use that data to drive improvements. And I think a lot of it is also the challenges that I've had are capacity of my colleagues. They're all doing amazing work. They've done a great job responding to the COVID challenges. And, they're in the kind of, let's just do things. We don't need more data. What do we need more data to tell us? We already know what we need to be doing, but we don't have access to data at the micro scale that Mariela is providing us with. And having that evidence-based data is so valuable to how we move forward with our projects that have any geospatial component to it. When COVID hit, I kind of made a resolution to myself that I wasn't going to move forward any project that didn't have massive ROI for multiple departments or had some budgetary impact, right? Because as soon as something hits, the vendors just come out of the woodwork and start to kind of email you and say they have the next solution that your city needs. And that was the lens through which that I was evaluating projects. So when I was talking to Mariela and she was telling me of this outcome, it was like, I can see value for this with our Department of Public Health. I can see value for this with our Parks and Recreation Services and how they're targeting certain neighborhoods for providing access to playground equipment during the summer. I can see value for this with our budget office and trying to develop a participatory budget process. But I think what was the greatest is that as I've started to share this with my colleagues, I've stopped pushing it on them. I've just been like, hey, I've got this project. It's really cool. This is the overall goal of it. This is the data we're getting. And I started to find that there are overlapping interests and that there's a lot of value that I didn't even think about, such as with our Office of Violence Prevention and the use of the data that Mariela can pull to inform how we might have interventions in the public space that can reduce violence in certain communities. And that's really powerful, especially right now as Philadelphia has made, I don't know if we made the news in Australia, but I had network members reach out to me from Europe. We had a shooting the other day, a police shooting. And it's just, that has been amplified as well as COVID. And so that's been one of the great things about working with Mariela and the data.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think this is something that we're starting to talk about more, and I hope can keep talking about, is particularly the role of the urban environment in safety and those links. And I think that particularly in light of the kind of current context that we're in, that's something that city governments actually have levers to control, I guess, is their built environment. And that's a real opportunity there.
Exactly.
I want to talk about specifically data innovation for a moment, and perhaps throw the conversation back to Mariela and Andrea. You're both looking at, not just more data for place, but different data for place. And you know, why do we need to understand places differently? Like, what's wrong with what we've got and what we understand? I'll start with you. That's a very loaded question. Of course, there's lots wrong with it, but I'd love to understand from your perspective, you know, why you think we need to think about it differently. I'll start with you, Mariela. If you could talk a little bit about State of Place's role in data innovation.
Yeah. Well, I think I'd like to tell you just the quick story of like my background, because that really shapes kind of why I do what I do and what we're trying and why we, measure what we measure. So, I grew up in Miami, Florida. It's very, it's not the glitzy part of Miami that is often portrayed in movies. Since I'm talking to a global audience, it's not Miami Vice. I grew up it's a very auto-dominated, suburban, in my case, low to middle income suburb, where if you didn't have a car, you weren't an equal person. And to the point that I attended the funeral of a 15-year-old friend who got run over by a car on a street very similar to the one I crossed all the time. So this became very personal for me, and I continue to ask myself the question: why are we doing this? Why are we designing cities for cars and not for people? But because I have this kind of social science, data geeky brain, I didn't want to tell people, hey, you have to design better, right? Even though I can like totally boss people around, I just didn't want to do that way. I wanted to use data and evidence to prove to people that design mattered, and it mattered across different aspects of quality of life. And so that's really what sparked me into the idea of metrics and measurements and all that kind of stuff. And in order to do what I wanted to do and advocate for better urban design via data, I had to quantify what is better urban design. And this was like 20 years ago when we started on this. We were thinking about very specifically walkability, but of course quality of place is much broader than that. So that's what led me to this journey of like what it is that we measure and why. It's the nuts and bolts of places. It's what we feel, touch, and interact with when we walk down the street, and yet we generally do not have a database of those features because it's super hard to collect. When we first started to collect this data, I was going across all of California doing as part of my PhD research, collecting this data manually, like forget about Google Street View or any of that stuff, and paper and pencil. And so, the fact that we have been able to now, almost 20 years later, automate this process using visual machine learning, I think that's really the key to being able to address this particular year and all of the problems that it's magnified in a very ugly way. I don't think we would have been able to help the city of Philadelphia in the same way had we not been able to do this, right? Because in order to understand the super complex relationship between urban design, COVID, health, urban flooding, heat waves, you need a lot. You need citywide data, or at least a good portion of it to do the kind of data crunching that we do at State of Place to create our forecast models. So I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it's great.
But the implications of all this, because everything that I just talked about seems very research-based and kind of data, you describe stuff. What I pride ourselves on this tool is that it takes that data and gives you like actionable stuff to do to make places better, where it's not just diagnosing like what's working and what's not and then kind of leaving you like, okay, you figure it out. We use those forecasting models to say, actually some of these urban design leverage points might work better for some outcomes versus others. So cities that have limited budgets, that gives them an opportunity to say, okay, maybe these are short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals.
Yeah, thanks. I think one thing I heard from what you're saying there, which I think is true to probably any data question, is that, we can sometimes think we've got a sort of silver bullet with data, but we actually, need to really be looking at places from lots and lots of different angles and getting more and more and more context, because cities are really, really complicated, and getting models that can sort of give us insight in what's going so that we can validate our decisions is hard. But the more we have and the more different types we have, the more important it is particularly sort of the way you're looking at linking some, climate and urban design and other health outcomes. I want to throw to Andrea on the data innovation question. You've been working with innovative data for a long time, before Neighbourlytics, and now with what you're doing with the Social Prosperity Standard and Launch Cities. Can you talk a little bit about why you think we need to think about measuring places differently? What new insights can we gain? Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Thanks. Someone else was bound to do it. Glad it could be me. As you said, Lucinda, cities are extremely complex places, and I think that often also, though, as several people have mentioned, resource constrained. And I think there's, on the one hand, this idea of using data, cities are very open to, but in many ways, it's just like, what data can we get? More data is better. And they're a bit overwhelmed about which data sets to look at and how to understand this data in context. And I think that's particularly true when you think about well-being or quality of life data. I think very often the data that is most accessible to local governments, that is quantitative, is outcome data that they're using as a proxy to really understand well-being, things like crime data, education, health outcome data, economic performance data. But that doesn't really make visible to them what levers are available to influence those outcomes. I think very often that's quite obfuscated when you're thinking about well-being, when you're just looking at crime data. Well, how do you change that? What are the levers beyond the traditional ones of just increasing police presence or tough on crime, which, very often those also don't seem to be driving the outcomes that we really want. How do we reveal the levers that are available to us? Very often at Neighbourlytics, we cite the Robert Wood Johnson study that talks about how your postcode is just about as likely to influence your long-term health outcomes, your life expectancy, as your genetic code. And where we live and how we experience where we live has a profound effect on our long-term health, on our psychological well-being, on our experience of daily life. And I think it's very difficult to get more data that really makes visible the levers that are available to local councils to really influence those outcomes before they get to the point where they're becoming outcomes. And so really finding and surfacing more data about how people are living in a place, because I think when we're measuring, by the time we get to those outcomes that we're measuring, we're not really seeing the impact that the place has on people and measuring it very directly and very immediately. When I talk often to our councils about well-being data, I really sort of think of it as the Venn diagram intersection between these three spheres of understanding subjective well-being, how people are feeling about their quality of life, their life satisfaction, this outcome data like crime, education, health outcomes, and then this behavioral data that we at Neighbourlytics look at really understanding how well the place is supporting the conditions necessary for good well-being, and what does how people are living in that place really tell us about that place's performance in quite a local way, because I think that's another thing that we've seen even within the same city. There are huge differences, huge disparities in how people experience the city, and so if we're not measuring that in a way that we can get quite local and look at what the differences and the similarities are in experience across different neighborhoods, it's very difficult to really be able to understand what's going to work one place might not work in another part of the city, and that taking sort of this one-size-fits-all approach, which I think some of those outcome data sets don't just sort of, they might show you the disparities in the outcome, but they don't really show you what the differences are that are necessarily driving that. And I think getting more data around how people are experiencing the places helps us to really surface those differences and then understand more what levers are available to councils to really drive change instead of having to guess or look at what worked well someplace else, which might be a city that has quite different circumstances or quite different living experience, and trying to kind of make that work for you without really knowing if it's really pulling the right levers for your council.
Yeah, thanks. And I think Mariela and Andrea, you both talked about the importance of localized data as well as having sort of multiple perspectives. Like, how do we understand the context and really sort of bring the scale in to understand where the levers of change are. I want to throw back to Emily and Michael for a moment. I'm wondering if there is sort of a specific use case, either with the projects that you've been working on with Mariela and Andrea, or outside, that have sort of been particularly relevant this year during COVID. If you could talk to an example of where data has kind of helped you, or alternatively, what's one sort of thing that was surprising or interesting to you that you found by looking at data differently? And I'll throw to Emily first.
I was going to say, Michael, you're welcome to go first. So I think I need to think about this for a little bit. I think what I've learned with data in the time of COVID is that I think the data that I found to resonate the most has been the data that sorry, I'm kind of like trying to formulate it in my head as we talk, but has been the data that's been able to be used by multiple departments to kind of kill multiple birds with one stone, right? So we are fiscally constrained, we are capacity constrained. So if I'm able to go to multiple departments and say, this one bit of data and this one project that we're pushing forward can help you achieve what you need to do, can help you achieve what you need to do, and I can help you too. I find that there's much more willingness to sit down and listen to what I'm trying to tell them and share with them, and that I'm here to help you. I mean, the very basis of my job is to create better cross-departmental collaboration, and data is a great tool to do that. So being able to have a data set like what Mariela is producing for Philadelphia has just been, I mean, I'm constantly blown away every time I talk about it. People are like, oh, that's really cool. I can use this. And, I keep on reaching out to Mariela and I'm like, we have another presentation to do because there's another department that wants to learn about this, which to me means I'm doing something right? So it's like, I want to keep on moving it forward. But I think also the thing that I like that we haven't gotten to just yet in Philadelphia, I only was able to fund Mariela for a pilot, which covered about a third of our city. But the next phase that we want to do in scaling up is a community engagement. And I think that that's going to be really powerful because right now with COVID, community engagement looks completely different. We can't have the same types of engagements that we had before where we're sitting around tables and pulling in all of this data. But can we use the data that Mariela is providing, use something like gamification and start to get data in a really creative way that can be used for our comprehensive planning process, that can be used for zoning conversations, that, there's just like so many applications that keep coming out through this. And I think the ability to engage the community around this data and then also empower the community with this data as well. So it's not only something that the city government has, but really going to the community and saying, you live here, this is the data, this is what we know because it's data, but you tell us what your community is and how you want it to change, and let's start to have a conversation around that is so powerful.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that role of data that can play in collaboration both internally within city government and with the community is really powerful and hard to do, but also something that I think that, is critical to we often think about the data itself being the silver bullet, but sometimes partly it's actually how we use that as a tool to bring people together to think differently. Exactly. Michael, do you have any examples of something, either something that was insightful, challenging, different from your perspective, or a use case with Neighbourlytics or outside of sort of what you've learned from a data perspective recently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. Thanks, Lucinda. I also like to second that. I think in my role here as the role of place services within council really is touches on a lot of those points that you mentioned about the benefit that data can bring in kind of unifying a lot of different departments. And I think within governments, each department can be quite siloed at times. And here in place services, we really are a multidisciplinary team, and our role of working from kind of creating places from start to end, these kind of end-to-end project managers, our day-to-day operations really are about connecting subject matter experts and people from different teams to help inform the project outcomes that we're after. But the benefit that this data is having is helping those conversations along, is really allowing us to kind of talk to our project partners and say, look, we've got this great array of data that we're able to leverage. We can start to understand how people are using places, what the strengths are at existing centres that we're looking to upgrade and assets that we're looking to develop. And starting to understand how this can inform more nuanced and more rich outcomes for our community members. We've done a lot of work at council, both kind of in terms of like a number of strategic documents lately that I found as particularly good use cases for the Neighbourlytics data. And for instance, the baseline that we've been able to get with Neighbourlytics through the Social Prosperity Standard has really started to allow us to understand well, we've got this foundation and what areas of what kind of physical, social and cultural and economic kind of indicators there are for places at present. And then also when we're starting to look at, our kind of short, medium and long-term planning for some of our really high growth precincts that we're looking at, how do we actually start to create visions or interventions that respond to those existing performance levels? And one specific example of that is that we've been working on developing a series or a suite of place plan documents that really are about capturing not only this existing character and how these communities live, how our residents engage with the public spaces that we have, but also starting to understand, okay, well, what are the strengths and where are the gaps that exist? And starting to understand things like, for instance, with the kind of physical indicators that Neighbourlytics captures, we've got, okay, for instance, with Granville, that we've got, a good amount of kind of public space, but at the connectors, the ability to actually get around, via active transport infrastructure isn't so great. And so it starts to lead and steer conversations around, okay, well, if we've got a good presence of amenity, how do we actually start to look at building into our projects, other means to actually connect people to these places or to these areas that are performing well, or where people are choosing to congregate, or where there's a lot of social chatter and where people are actually gathering. And that's data that we don't necessarily or didn't have previously, that has started to really shape the development of some of our strategic outcomes. And we've also, and that's one example of a use case.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for sharing that, both Emily and Michael. I'm going to jump to our last question now because I'm conscious of time, but we have a brain's trust here of people who are working in quite an innovative way with data and with city government. And I'm wondering if there's one piece of advice that you would share with another city government when they are thinking about using data to understand place, or they're using about data as an approach to community building. And whether that's, we've heard today around, using it as a tool for collaboration or for new insights, or there's a whole range of things. But what's one piece of advice that you would give to other city governments? And it's a tricky question, but I might jump to Mariela first.
Thanks, Lucinda. The first thing is just get started. Stop. Like we made a conscious decision a while back. Like, okay, we're not gonna focus right now on preaching the power of data. We're hoping that enough cities have kind of come that way, and they have. I mean, when we first started State of Place, its concept was almost 10 years ago. So people, cities weren't there yet. So the fact that they are there, at least understanding the value, maybe they're not collecting the data, that makes the conversation easier. But you still need to get started. The other thing that I would say is if you think about, okay, well, what are the barriers to getting started, right? How do you find the champion within your community to say yes, or within your city to say this is, we need a more data-driven approach. For us, for State of Place, I mean, of course, we always try to find who that champion is in the city and begin conversations with them first, which, of course, with the city of Philadelphia was easily Emily. But then how do you get that champion, like Emily has, to say, bring a variety of people together around understanding the value of this particular data set that we happen to provide, because it touches upon so many aspects of spatial injustice that, again, have been magnified this year. And so that would be sort of the, get started, find your champion, and then use that champion to garner cross-departmental support, because especially now with COVID, you kind of need to prove the higher return on investment or bang for the buck, like Emily mentioned, to get things funded, right? So if there is a way for you to, and maybe I'm speaking a little bit more to the data provider companies and the cities, but to make that case, where that this, because it's the same with you guys in Neighbourlytics. I mean, your data touches upon multiple aspects of city departments, and so I'm sure that also made it easier for you, Michael, to bring on and of course implement and make an impact. But overall, just be bold, get started, go.
Thank you. Andrea, what's your one piece of advice that you'd give to city governments?
So I think I build off of what Mariela said, and also say, don't be afraid to be open to new types of data and new data sources and new applications of that data. I think that, two things that the COVID has particularly surfaced for us with the councils that we're working with and with our data are doing community engagement in a traditional way, doing surveys and focus groups and that type of outreach is going to be challenging, not just now, but probably for a fair bit of time in the future, given COVID. You're not going to be bringing a group of residents together in a forum to do a focus group with them, or doing door-to-door surveys and things like that. And the other thing that we've really seen is how much the local experience of the neighborhood has been amplified by COVID, where people aren't able to really travel far afield from their homes and aren't wanting to travel far afield from their homes to have their daily needs met in this current environment. And so having alternate ways to really understand how people are living and experiencing their local environment, and being open to those new data sources, I think is going to continue to be quite important for local government to be able to make decisions in a way that still factors in the human aspect of the places and the human experience of places, and to really be willing to try using new different types of data to understand that, I think will be very important.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Emily?
Well, besides echoing everything that Mariela and Andrea said, I think my piece of advice would be use data to remove the emotion and fear. I think a lot of times we are guided by what we think is information, but ultimately it's a result of emotion or fear of something. And I that's one of the reasons I like data, is it is what it is. And I think that can help in a lot of varieties within the city. I wouldn't say that to the community, because I think emotion is what they need to bring to the table, and to stick to the vision. So, we know data works. Just kind of commit to the fact that we need to use it, and we need to continually find new ways to get it and continue to innovate in that space. So.
Thank you, Emily. And Michael, you have the last word.
Wow, what else can I say? It's hard not to reiterate some of the points that our other panel members have made today. For me, I think that it's important to not forget your why, and I think that what is the driving motivation for a government body or a council that started, to help you on this journey. For us, it really is about being able to continue to deliver and provide places that are people-centric and focused on delivering, more livable outcomes for our community members. And it's great to be able to have data that can do this. And it's important, I think, when you're starting to get onto this data journey, not to forget or not to shy away from the fact that sometimes you're just going to have more questions than answers. And that's a great thing. It starts to open up a plethora of alternative avenues for project development, for new conversations, and to really allow for more rich insights to occur. And that's something that we've definitely embraced at the City of Parramatta whilst we've been partnering with Neighbourlytics, but also with all of the other councils that have been part of the Launch Cities program. And it's really great to be able to have a sounding board of people who are working in very different and diverse geographical areas that are coming up with different questions and challenges, but how we can kind of leverage the data to embrace these new opportunities has been really exciting. And so don't shy away from the questions that might emerge, because they really do lead to some really great outcomes in the end.
Michael, Emily, Mariela, Andrea, thank you so much for taking time, getting up early, staying up late to be part of this chat today as part of Smart Cities Week. Really excited to see what the future of data for community building particularly is. I think it's one of the most important questions that cities will be asking in the year to come as we kind of look at what the wake of COVID is for all our various cities. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to staying in touch.